Hey, good morning. Good morning to you online. If you're worshiping with us for the first time, we're so glad that you're here. Thank you that you would choose to worship with us. If you're here in this space for the first time, welcome as well. I don't know if you heard, but I heard next Sunday, breakfast in the lobby. And I also noticed there was a huddle back there with Pastor Dave. I think they're figuring out where to put the omelet bar. Just saying, I'm hoping there's an omelet bar. Pretty sure it's bagels and donuts and fruit. But let's fingers crossed for the omelet bar. Everybody on board with that? All right, we'll keep talking to omelet bar. Pastor Dave just walked in. We'll make sure he gets that on the plan. He can work on that while I'm preaching. So we're finishing our Invisibles series this morning, and we're glad that you could be here. I've really enjoyed this series where we're looking at characters that we may not necessarily remember or have ever heard of from Scripture and their stories, and how those stories, because of the relationships they have with the people around them, because of the relationship with God, there are lessons that we can take from those stories. And today's, as we wrap up this series, is a tragic Old Testament story. It's only a parenthetical statement in chapter 4 of 2 Samuel, and we'll be looking at that. And then there's a follow-up story that happens about 10 years later, and again, we'll be reading that. So some background before we read is Saul is now the king of Israel in chapter 4 of 2 Samuel, and Jonathan, his son, is the prince of Israel. And they are in the midst of a battle against the Philistines. And during that battle, they are defending the Philistines. During that battle, defending against the Philistines, and during that battle, they both will die. And so today's invisible character is not Saul or not Jonathan, because you likely heard of them, but Jonathan's son named Mephibosheth. Now we're going to say that together. If you're online, you can do it as well. Mephibosheth. 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 And you say it really fast. No matter how you say it, it's going to be fine. But it's Mephibosheth, okay? He's the son of Jonathan. This is also one of my favorite Old Testament stories. And when we were planning out the series, as we were sitting together in our preaching team meeting, I kept fighting for this story because I wanted it shared, and I wanted to be the one that shared it. So that's why it's on this week, because I asked for it. So we're going to read 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4, and it's up on the screen. And notice that there's parentheses on this story. It's a parenthetical statement made by the writer of 2 Samuel. It says that Saul's son Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth, who was crippled as a child. On the same day, his father and grandfather are killed. Remember, they were killed in a battle against the Philistines. On the same day that they were killed, an accident has left Mephibosheth crippled. When the child's nurse heard the news about Saul and Jonathan dying, about the Philistines overrunning and winning the battle, she picked him up and fled. But as she hurried away, she dropped him, and he became crippled. It's a tragic story of this 5-year-old boy running to escape an army that has already killed his grandfather and father and is going to kill him as well. The same day that they die, he has this tragic accident and is crippled for life. And it's this parenthetical statement. He's the definition of an invisible story. It's just a few sentences about this guy named Mephibosheth. See, in one day, his life is transformed. The first 5 years of his life, he's lived in a palace, and he's lived this life of privilege. But then parts of his family are killed. His legs are made useless for the rest of his life. And so Mephibosheth is taken into hiding. He's hidden because they want to save him from the invading Philistines. And so in chapter 4, the writer tells us this story. because there's another story that's going to come 10 years later that the author is also going to tell. But before we get to that, we need to know where Mephibosheth ended up. Mephibosheth was taken into hiding into a town called Lo-debar, L-O-D-E-B-A-R, Lo-debar. Lo-debar literally means nothing. It means no thing. And so Lo-debar is the poorest of towns. It can be translated no thing. Lo-debar could also be translated as no place, or it could be translated as no pasture. So we get the idea that Lo-debar is the lowest of the towns where you would want to be. There's no resources, there's no pasture. It's not a place, it's nothing. It's Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth is hiding in this town. He's living in a nothing town. A crippled boy living in a nothing town. It sounds like the start of a Bruce Springsteen song, doesn't it? Right? Because it's born down in a dead man's town. The first kick I took is when I hit the ground. Thank you. Thanks, Ed. Yeah. If Pastor Jeff were here, he would know that. It's Lo-debar. It's a nothing town. And here we find this boy in hiding. You see, in ancient times, being crippled is a death sentence. There's no recovery, there's no restoration, there's no hope. And it's the story surrounded by parentheses. He's a nobody living in a nothing town. And the writer is making a point in chapter 4, and that point is going to be made clear in chapter 9. Sorry, I forgot. So a decade has passed since Saul and Jonathan have been killed. A decade has passed since Mephibosheth has been injured and crippled for life. And 10 years have gone by. Mephibosheth is probably about 15 years old. He's a young adult in ancient times. And the story that the writer shares, again, is up on the screen. Let me read parts of it to you. One day, David asked, "Is there anyone left of Saul's family? If so, I'd like to show him some kindness in honor of Jonathan." It happened that a servant from Saul's household named Ziba was there. They called him into David's presence, and the king asked him, "Are you Ziba?" "Yes, sir," he replied. And the king asked, "Is there anyone left from the family of Saul to whom I can show some godly kindness?" Now, the writer is letting us know, or there's something going on that we may miss out, but the writer knows that those who are reading this would know immediately that when a conquering king takes the throne, you want to know if there are any relatives, anyone who could claim the kingship. And so David asks, is there anyone in Saul's line? And David says, I want to show them kindness and favor. But everybody else is possibly thinking something else. If you want to know what they might be thinking, if you've watched Game of Thrones, then you know. Leave it there. So David asked Ziba, Saul's servant, are there any heirs? Because Ziba would know. Ziba was the closest, most intimate servant of Saul. And so Ziba would know what relatives might be left. David's motivation is to show kindness and grace. But of course, Ziba likely doesn't believe this because this is not normal. Normally, the king would want to know who's left alive so that they can be killed to avoid any potential assassination attempts. And Ziba says, King David, there's a crippled guy. He's living in Lo-debar. He's a nothing guy living in a nothing town. He's all that's left. And David sends messengers to Mephibosheth in Lo-debar. And he says, bring him to the palace. So the writer continues, when Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, who was the son of Saul, came before David, he bowed deeply, abasing himself, honoring David. David spoke his name, Mephibosheth. And he answered, yes, sir. So when he is summoned and brought to the throne of David, Mephibosheth probably expects this is his last day. Why else would the king want him? He's a nothing guy living in a nothing town, hiding, crippled, insignificant, broken. It could be assumed he's an enemy of the king. Listen to the fear and the tension in Mephibosheth's words. David begins, it says, it's up on the screen, don't be frightened. Why would he have to say, don't be frightened? Because he was scared. David says, don't be frightened, Mephibosheth. I'd like to do something special for you in memory of your father, Jonathan. To begin with, I'm returning to you all the properties of your grandfather Saul. Furthermore, from now on, you'll take all your meals at my table. Shuffling and stammering, not looking him in the eye. Do you sense the fear? Mephibosheth said, who am I that you pay attention to a stray dog like me? David then called in Ziba, Saul's right-hand man, and he told him, everything that belonged to Saul and to his family, I've handed over to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants will work his land and bring in the produce, provisions for your master's grandson. Mephibosheth himself, your master's grandson, from now on will take all his meals at my table. Now, Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants, so quite a staff now is going to be available to Mephibosheth. And then Ziba answers, he says, all that my master the king has ordered his servants, your servant will surely do. And Mephibosheth ate at David's table, just like one of the royal family. Mephibosheth also had a small son named Micah. All who were part of Ziba's household were now the servants of Mephibosheth. So David restores his land. Mephibosheth will no longer live in a nothing town. David provides workers for the land, and he assigns Ziba, this most loyal servant of his grandfather Saul, is now going to be Mephibosheth's right-hand man and going to make sure that all the fields, so Mephibosheth is set up to prosper. David chooses to honor his friendship with Jonathan, doing what was unexpected and extravagant. And this is one of those stories that's full of love and a reflection of God's love. But here's why it's my favorite story. So if you wanted to emphasize something, if you're sending a text to somebody or if you're typing on your computer and you wanted to emphasize something, there's different ways that you could emphasize something. You could make it bold. You could put it into italics. You could highlight it. You could do all those things with your thumbs, right? Everybody agree? That's how if you want to emphasize a statement, right? All caps. That'll get someone's attention in the text, right? Why are you yelling at me? Right? Right? So we know that's how you emphasize something today in the 21st century. There are plenty of options. Emphasis in ancient times was different. You're telling an oral story, so you can't use bold. You can't use cap locks. You're maybe writing it on papyrus or you're chiseling it into stone and there's no way to change the color of the font. So how do you emphasize something? you repeat it, and you repeat it, and you repeat it. We do that sometimes, right? I've told this story before. If you have a toddler and they're running towards a hot stove, what do you say? No, 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 right? For emphasis, you don't just say no and leave it. You say no, 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 no. You want to make an emphasis. You want to make sure that no is what you're saying. So you emphasize it over and over and over again. You repeat it. That's how you emphasize. Now, there is repetition in the story that we just read, and we could miss it because it wasn't bold, it wasn't in caps lock, it wasn't in italics. It was just something we said, and I said it 4 times. The repetition is this: Mephibosheth ate at the king's table. Now, in the 21st century, we again could miss this completely. He ate at the king's table. Table sharing in the 21st century for us today is entirely different. Last night, we ordered out. You know why? Because we were in a hurry. Why were we in a hurry? No reason, except that's the world we live in, right? We live in a fast food, Uber Eats, restaurant dining world. And food is about calories in, so we can move on to what's more important. Now, we have times where meals are set aside and they're special. Thanksgiving, right? Holidays, birthdays. But in ancient times, the table was significant. And who was at the table? Who was present at the table was significant. Brennan Manning, one of my favorite authors, writes this. He says, in the Near East, to share a meal with someone is a guarantee of peace, trust, fraternity, and forgiveness. And he says this: the shared table symbolizes a shared life. An Orthodox Jew's saying, I would like to have dinner with you, is a metaphor that implies I would like to enter into friendship with you. Now, Jesus practice this art of table sharing all the time. He was eating with people who religious people wouldn't eat with. That was one of the accusations made against him, is that he spent time with sinners and he spent time with tax collectors, that he was at tables eating with people that religious people don't eat with. Jesus was communicating a message that you are valuable to me, that you are important to me. But he was eating with those who the religious folks would not have sat at table with. But imagine the impact those meals had on the people who were present. Taking away their shame, taking away their humiliation, taking away their guilt. Imagine at the meal, those people discovered that they mattered, that there was a sense of dignity that they discovered when no one else would be with them at mealtime. So you see, Mephibosheth's story is so much more than a parenthetical story about a crippled boy. It's a story full of love, and it's communicating the kind of love that's available to us. That God's love supersedes any condition, any circumstance, any place that we find ourselves. And so when I read this story, I see 2 challenges for me, for you, for all of us. Whether you're here in this space, whether you're watching online, the first challenge is this: what would it look like if we were to practice the art of table sharing? I don't mean inviting strangers over your house for dinner. I know that you're not going to do that, and neither am I. But what would it look like if you were to listen for who God is calling you to support or forgive or encourage or to make whole? What if there's someone who you could share a table and in a sense you're saying, I want to share life? It's why our one-on-one challenge is so significant, so important, and a way for us to communicate the love of God to others. That we don't just simply mean to invite. We don't simply mean to serve. We mean to say we're sharing our life with you who may be hurting. We'll share our life with you and we'll walk through whatever it is you need to walk through. That we want to offer peace and trust, and that we want friends to become like family. I do funerals. I do quite a few funerals, and at every funeral I comment on the people who are present, and I mention that the people here are family and friends who are like family. And those funerals where there are the most friends who are like family are always the most beautiful stories of someone's life. Someone who says, well, I called him Uncle Dave, but really we're not related. And after those stories are shared, I get up again and then I say, continue to share those stories. Because while your DNA may say that you are not related, your stories communicate that you are. See, because when we share our lives with others, somehow there's this connection that gets made. And it lasts beyond a lifetime. Because we're part of someone's legacy. That's why I find this one-on-one challenge so inspiring. Because what does it look like for you and I to share our life with others? To invite someone to a table. Here's the other challenge that I see in this. It's kind of the flip side of that. Is that maybe for you, things are just really difficult. You're feeling knocked down. You're feeling bruised, broken, feeling crippled. It's like being a nothing living in a nothing town. And maybe even hiding from God. Because somehow you've heard or you've been convinced that God is angry with you. That God is disappointed with you. That God would never invite you to a table. And maybe you're that, hey, if I were to come inside this building, the roof would cave in. And maybe you're online and you're thinking, I'm surprised the internet didn't break. Maybe you need to hear this. That God has a place for you at his table. That regardless of your flaws or shortcomings, regardless of where you've been and what you've done, and even what you've thought about God in the past, regardless of all those things, you are invited to the table. Mephibosheth's story tells us that God loves us so much and wants us to get to know him. That we can discover that God is not angry with us. That we can see that God does not expect us to pay for our misdeeds and our mistakes. But here's the danger in all of this. In our world today, we have this belief that we can do it ourselves. And we've almost proven that, in a sense. I found this is somewhat, a preacher preached this 50, 60 years ago. I had to do the math. And it's probably wrong. But here's what a preacher said decades ago. See how I did that? He said this, our inventions startle us. Now remember, this is 60 years ago. Our inventions startle us, and our great buildings dwarf the pyramids, right? And we built some pretty good things. Any engineers in the room? Good for you. He says, we go through the air faster than birds. He said that 60 years ago. Wouldn't he be fascinated by what we can do today? We now take flights to the moon, to the whatever, just for fun. So we can float, and then we come back. We go through the seas faster than fish, and on the land faster and swifter than horses. He didn't say this, but we can write something down on a phone, and someone across the other side of the world gets it immediately. We've figured it out. We have mastered technology. He goes on to say, we can do anything, and yet we are bedeviled, and we are dragged down, and we are cursed and blasted and damned with a thing that holds us that we can't get rid of. Because as smart as we may be and as technologically savvy as we may become, we can't save ourselves. Romans chapter 5, Paul writes this, but God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. That while we were in a nothing town, living a nothing life, feeling broken and crippled, Christ died for us while we were still sinners. Hey, the band's going to come up. We're going to sing. They're going to sing a song. We're going to sing with them. And I don't want you to join in singing right away. They may tell you to. I'm going to tell you not to. I want you just to reflect just for a moment on maybe God is stirring in you that there is someone you need to invite, that you need to invite into your life, that they may discover that you are willing to share life with them, that you would invite them to the table, that they might find out no matter where they've been, no matter what they've done, no matter what they've thought about God in the past, they may discover that you care for them, and in that you would communicate that God cares for them as well. Or maybe you are the one who's feeling like you're in a nothing town, and I pray that you would know that there's a God who loves you. We're going to sing these words. We sang them already. You're still the rock that I cling to when everything else falls apart. You're still the one that I'm building on, the reason my hopes never lost. You're the reason my hopes never lost. And then we sing this. You'll come through now like you did back then, time and time and time again.